Abi Glencross is a former New Harvest Fellow, a chemical engineer that used to grow meat in the lab, and from there she ventured into the field of wheat, and today she's a heritage grain farmer, a sustainable food system expert, and the co-founder of Sustainable Food Story. But will she ever go back to cellular agriculture? I guess we'll find out. A warm welcome to Abi Glencross.
Hello, hopefully you can hear me. So my name's Abi Aspen, and yeah, I was New Harvest's first ever research fellow. And so I did a couple of years of my PhD working in cellular agriculture, and then I left, and essentially I left to be a farmer. But I'll explain a little bit more about that as we go. So yeah, so I suppose I still class myself a bit as a bioengineer. I think I more took a prolonged hiatus. So I'm still a bioengineer. I actually trained to be a scientist at Bath University in the UK, and I'm a chemical engineer by trade. And then my final year project, I got really into lab grown meat through a really amazing scientist or engineer called Dr. Marianne Ellis. But as I left, so now, yes, now I'm a wheat farmer, a heritage and sort of population wheat farmer. I can explain a bit more about that. But in a nutshell, I'm really sort of sustainable food systems researcher, and I do a lot to do with sustainable food systems. And Sustainable Food Story started as a supper club, basically because we couldn't find anywhere good to eat, and now it's turned into sort of a more international roving workshop and like speaking experiential sort of thing. And we're just finished writing our first book, which is quite fun. But how did it all begin? Sorry, I skipped a bit forward with my terrible mouse pad skills. So yeah, so I was a master's student at Bath, University of Bath in the UK, and I was working, basically when you get a final dissertation in your 5th year, you have to choose one of a number of topics, and I ended up getting one on cellular agriculture, and it was all to do with growing beef in the lab, and it was very inspired by Mark Post's work and New Harvest. And so I kind of really got sold on this idea of being able to use my engineering experience and knowledge for something that hopefully would be a bit better for the world, because a lot of my peers went into oil and gas and fast moving consumer goods, and I actually worked in oil and gas for a year. I think it was I was looking at a presentation one day where there was a family of cats living under a distillation column, and it really started making me think about the environment and the impacts that humans are having on the environment. So I thought, this is great. I can combine my love of environmental, trying to help that sort of section, and my nerdy engineering side, which I never actually thought I'd use, but sort of mashed them together. And so when I left the lab, I did a research project over the summer of my final year, still in Bath. And then I thought, do you know what? It's great. Haven't done enough academia. I'll go and do a PhD. And so spent a year trying to find funding for an idea I had about creating sort of perfusion networks in thicker meats, which nowadays was very ambitious. But it was then I really got in contact with New Harvest, and they were amazing in helping me find funding from 2 philanthropists in the States to fund my research. And again, I thought I knew sort of everything. I thought I knew everything, and so I was like, I'm going to do this in London where there was no one else doing it. So I worked in the dentistry department of King's College, and so when I think back, maybe we were destined for it not to quite work out, but it was such an amazing experience. But I also learned, and the reason I've used this picture is because there was a lot of media hype around lab grown meat, especially with the burger, and even back then, so that was 6 years ago, there was a lot of hype around it. And actually New Harvest have always been very good at being very honest and open with what's going on, and it was in the research stages now, and it's still in the research. It was in the research stages then, and it's still very much in the research fundamental building block stages now. And I think my idea of making perfusion networks, it's great, but there's so many things, whether it's the media or the scaffold or the bioreactors, there's so many missing pieces to create something even that's non-carcase or processed. and I realised that it was quite an ambitious thing to think of vascularization or perfusion within lab-grown meat. But I got really into the kind of science communication side. I really, really loved it. And this was an exhibition we did with a lovely photographer called Jo Sarah at Summer's House, sort of looking at what the future of meat could look like. But the science communication side was amazing, and I might have loved it a little bit more than I loved the research. But I did enjoy my job. However, I realised that why I left was there was a lot of, as I was doing a lot of this social engagement, I realised that I was saying that the system is so bad and it's gone so wrong, we're now having to make lab-grown meat to sort of undo what industrial farming has done to our food system. And so I kept getting asked at talks, well, what should our food system look like? And I remember this word agroecological farming, and I was like, this is what the food system should look like. And then people would ask more questions about it, and I realised I didn't really know. I didn't really know what the food system should look like. I was just trying to solve something in the case that the food system had gone terribly, terribly wrong. And I think it started getting me thinking a lot on my own in the dentistry lab in the 15th floor of Guy's Hospital in London. It got me thinking more about, when did technological advancement become easier to do than social change? Why are we not eating less meat? Why are we not just got more plant-based diets? And then it was just all these things packed together, and even the fact that, you know, we were going and sitting in our labs and making decisions on how we think food should be eaten and produced, when actually we had no idea about how the people were producing food now and what that meant and what their thoughts were, and why are they not involved in these conversations, and why have I only met one farmer in the whole time I've been doing this? And I think it just, you know, why are these farmers not appreciated and now, and why, if you say you're a farmer, do people think that you're not as intelligent as if you're a scientist? And all these questions came up, and I realized that I didn't have enough life experience to be doing this work, I suppose. I was a bit worried maybe it would turn into sort of a Norman Borlaug scenario again, where you make this thing and you think it's great and actually has consequences further than you. And I think that at 24, I just needed more life experience in what a sustainable food system could or should look like, because I felt a little bit lost, and not through anyone else's fault except for my own very, very inquisitive brain, I think. I needed to understand why all this deforestation that we were seeing on the news was happening. I need to understand why farmers are spraying our fields so liberally, and again, they're being vilified for doing all this. But why? Does someone really want to spray their fields and it look terrible and be terrible for people in the environment? And also, why are all farmers sort of white middle-aged men? Again, I couldn't really understand this. I was like, where are the women? Where have the women gone? Sorry for that chap who I've used this picture because he's probably very nice. So I left the lab with quite a heavy heart. I think if you could have taken a holiday from your PhD, maybe I'd have done that, but unfortunately you can't. It doesn't really work like that. And I think that I needed to go and learn what food systems really could look like. So I left the lab and went on a bit of an adventure. From Andrew Pulling's lab, where I was working in Canada, I went to a place called Stone Barns in Blue Hill, and I learned what very, very, very regenerative, inclusive community farming could look like. And I learned to be a farmer, basically. They took me in and let me stay in a very lovely ladies' mansion, and just taught me to farm. And I just came every day, and I worked in the bakery once a day because I'd been starting to work with farmers during my PhD. I did a project called Our Field, helping a farmer share the risk of growing grains. And so I knew sort of the basics of farming. But I left to join a farm. So I went to Stone Barns and Blue Hill, and then I also, you know, the very, very lovely side of it. And then I went and worked in Canada as well, for a family who were so lovely and took me in, but they were growing sort of this heritage corn, and all the fields around them, including the husband's family, were growing GM corn and soy. And because they didn't want to do that, they'd basically been disowned by the family. And it was corn and soy as far as the eye could see. And so I had the two kind of different looks at it, you know, outlooks on it. This very more industrial type of farming, and people who are trying to change the grain, And then it's very lovely farming, which was amazing, but also had quite a lot of money behind it. There was an amazing restaurant on the farm. You know, it didn't need much changing, and you know, they paid the interns, but they needed this restaurant to really give them the income that they needed. But it taught me a lot about farming for chefs as well, which I'll come into a bit more. But I ended up back in the UK because I realised that the UK is definitely my home, and I missed it, and I wanted to come back and try and change all these things I'd learned while I'd been away. And I ended up at this lovely place where I am now, called Duchess Farms, and I really I think that I realised on my travels that, and through my research basically, that we think of cellular agriculture very much as animal farmers and dairy farmers and the impacts for them, but really we need to think about farming as a whole system. So no, animal farmers are very, very linked to people that grow crops, whether it's them, whether it's someone in the Amazon rainforest, whether it's, you know, that, because we want these pastoral systems of grazing grass, which we can't eat and process, and managing our land really well. But actually, generally, we grow crops and we feed them to animals. And that's a big problem. And I was realizing that we were growing crops and we were feeding them to cells. And was that solving a problem, or was that just creating another industrial system? So I ended up here, and this is a sort of conventional farm that is looking at more regenerative practices. But I came in and started running the grains part of it, so the heritage and population grains. And so now we don't spray those grains. We don't spray them. They're part of a practicing organic system. We now have sheep. Max in the picture, he's sheep back on the farm. But it takes a lot of labour of love of 3, you know, reasonably young farmers to change the grain. And it's interesting because Max and I are both not, we're first generation farmers. So Oscar's family have owned the farm for about 6 generations, I think. And we came in, and this is an amazing place to share farm, even though it is a conventional one, and we're trying to change it to post-industrial farming. So basically no chemicals. So why, the overarching of like, why did I do it? Why did I leave? Why did I try and do these things? Sorry, it's another picture of me looking like it up. But I wanted to understand if we could make food and farming, essentially food and farming, as sexy and desirable as biotech. Because you can go into a room and you say lab grown meat, and I think when I was 24 or so, when I was doing it, you go into a party and everyone was like, this is the lab meat lady sort of thing. And I think it let my ego run away with me a little bit. But I wanted to understand if, like, can we get people to value their farmers in the same way they valued me and others while we were doing biotech. And that was like my aim when I left and I came to Duchess. So I think I did not a bad job. That was the Observer Monthly. But on the whole, maybe not. Maybe I'm never going to make it as sexy and desirable as biotech. But on this journey, I've really, really, really learned a lot. So I may have skipped a slide in a weird sense, but so I learned a lot. But the main thing is, being a farmer as a job is amazing. Like, I love the outdoors. I love the day-to-day. You have a thing at the start, you have a seed that goes in the ground, and then you have flour that you deliver to bakeries and you get bread back. And it's a very tangible system. It's, you know, working in lab was very every day, you know, I'd kill more cells. But here I actually, my mill probably kill feral lot of plants, but there is you can see as a system. So as a job, it's lovely. And I think I went in a bit all guns blazing of like, you know, how do you change the system? And I realized that farming is obviously hard, you know, the labor and stuff, the weather. You know, I don't think I've ever looked at the weather forecast more in my whole life. However, I realized a big thing lately is reports like the IPCC report, and in the UK, the National Food Strategy, and all of these things are telling us to farm better. They are saying, you know, farmers, we need to be doing this, and people, we need to buy this. But the fact of the matter is, growing food better at lower yields is more expensive than not, because things like labour are taxed in a way that fossil fuels and machinery is not. So it always ends up being more expensive, and actually things that are subsidised are generally the large scale farms get more subsidy, this is in the UK anyway, than small scale farms. And so I realised that, you know, there's so many people who are very, very top of their game, campaigning for this better food system, and the government saying it and the world is saying it, but yet we're still in this country allowing trade deals to happen with other countries that do a big deal of deforestation, and that deal a lot in poor animal husbandry practices and cheap food that will be imported here. And the legislation that we're actually making is so incongruent with what the whole world is saying. I realized to be a good farmer is a labor of love to a certain degree, and I've done a lot with the farm to help them stop spraying and show them that there's value to be added in their products. But I realized that this problem has got so large and so big, and it's not being talked about in the right way in the right places, that I think that the gaping hole that is this problem of animal agriculture and industrial farming sort of maybe needs these plasters like lab grown meat, because I thought that we could solve it with social change and with good farming, but I think that it may have gone too far for that. So, and also I think there was just some other things like why farmers are paid so badly, and I think it's really hard. We did this show called £1 Million Menu for the BBC, a sustainable food story, and we'd use sort of terms like agroforestry, or really the nuances of sustainability were in our menu, but they chose the lady who was vegetarian because vegetarian is easy to understand, whereas like agroforestry, almonds and eating offal is a little bit more complex. So I realized that people don't like complexity, and the food system is very, very complex. So why have I come back? And I think my thought process on a few things has really changed. So one thing everyone said, and I also believed, was animals are the best bioreactors, and nature has evolved over a million years of creating this amazing thing that takes cellulose structures and makes them into food and manure, which we then can spread on the fields, which is true. And I agree, but even in local, when we think of a local farm, even in local farm, a lot of that is not happening. That cyclical idea of a cow, in a lot of even our local farms here, even the small ones, that they're being fed grain and they're being kept in, and their poop is put in a slurry pit, because it's hard to have all of those aspects on a farm and do your farming and sell your product and stuff. So quite often it's just like, feed is cheap, feed it to the cow, and then they poop everywhere. Whereas actually there are more mixed farms popping up, but most are getting kind of all clumped together into these huge farms where linear is still weirdly cheaper than thinking holistically. So that was one. And even things like, we have a lot of TB testing where we are. There's all these sort of extra layers on top of it, which means they are great, but in the way that most of us farm them, possibly they're not. And the second thing I kept saying or thinking was like, why not feed food to people instead of cells or animals? And I agree again with that. The idea of that sentiment is completely right, but weirdly we've created a system where we want to grow as much food as quickly as possible in as much quantity as possible, with some weird like restrictions on, like, for grain anyway, it's like protein content or this, that and the other. So it doesn't really hold true, because not all of that food could go directly to people because of the crops we grow. It'd be great if we grow way more horticultural products on smaller scales and a lot more of them, but not everyone wants to be a farmer. So you end up having large fields of crops, and a lot of them are still kind of naff grains. So you realize that these spaces are being used, and maybe the idea in my head was like, we should turn, loads more people should farm, we should split it up, and we should all grow, vegetables or orchards or whatever it is. And you realize that, again, that's sort of a dream that most people don't really want to engage in farming. And so they get made into these huge farms and farmed by like 3 people, which is actually still on our farm. There's not very many of us farming it, and it's quite a large space. And farmers are selling these crops to a commodity market, which is the animal food market, because to sell them to people, actually the standards are higher and all this sort of things. So they know there's a consistent market, reasonably consistent. They'll always take their food. So if you sell it to animal food market, then you always get your money for it. But it's a really low margin. So if something goes wrong, it's a terrible idea, and a lot of it is propped up by subsidies. But so this is how you realise that meat and animal farmers affect arable farmers as well, and it's all linked, but it's all just very, very complicated. And a lot of this grain and a lot of these vegetables and everything get wasted because they don't meet the aesthetic standards, they don't meet the nutritional standards of what you want in the system. So cellular agriculture and other alternative proteins might offer a way for those standards to be like smoothed out. So it's like if you have a process before it goes to the cells, then instead of having that direct aesthetic nutrition, whatever it is, standard to go straight to people, I think that they will be able to go to cells which have a bit more lenience than people do, and how things look and stuff. And one of the last ones is we shouldn't
Abi, we cannot hear you.
Don't want to kill the animals on the land, but it's the only way they can make enough income to keep fighting the good fight, sort of thing. So I think that's another interesting opportunity for lab grown meat, because it's like where those animals have value, but if they don't have to be killed to have value, that means you can have animals back on the land without having to worry about all the aspects of killing an animal, if you just take a biopsy. But that has value and a value added product. So you might see more mixed farms, and you realize a lot of why farmers are not farming as well as maybe they should be comes down to trying to make enough money to carry on farming the next year. For the most part, there are different size farms and everything, but so it's hard to think of farming in the best way you can unless you're really, really into it. When if your agronomist is there and most of them are still saying spray those crops or get rid of flea beetle, you kind of do it because in case you don't, then you've got no crops that year. And it's probably the most dependent job I've ever had on like that very fine moment of deciding what to do at that one time. So farmers have a lot of things to contend with. This is just a field of wheat. I must have had it in there for some reason, but it's a nice field of wheat. So why have I come back? And so what are my aims instead of just sort of yabbering on? And so basically I really want to link the worlds of biotech and farming and food production. I think there's a big gap between the two, because not a huge amount of people can speak tissue engineering, cellular agriculture language, and also a food and farming language, because they're very different, and the way you speak to both parties is very different. And I want to make sure that scientists working in the field have the materials and the knowledge to empower them to be able to empower regenerative farming. So if they're using wastes, if they want certain animal cells, if they, it should be there for them to make it the best they can and not just replace one industrial system with another, because if we're not careful, that's what will happen. And it probably will also happen as well. I think that's, we seem to have like this two thing of like, it will either be good or it be bad, but actually it's going to be this very broad landscape, I believe, in where it has, more industrial and less industrial ways of doing it, like farming itself. And I want to see, the current, but also the new wave, the new generation of farmers seeing these things as an opportunity rather than scary, or rather than something that's going to destroy their business. Because although it's another, just need to see it as another food product. And I think that maybe the problems that cell ag are making a little bit are that we should stop calling cell ag companies something farm, because you wouldn't call like Marmite factory a Marmite farm. So it's a process, it's a thing, unless it's on the farm, a farm, which quite possibly it could be. But I think maybe, if it's based in London, in the middle of London, don't call it something farm, because I think you're just going to piss people off. And I think now I've realized over the last few years, having looked at both sides, that sustainability has so many faces, and that we just really need to think of all the possible answers and work together to come to sort of any conclusion that we can, or just work together in general, I think. So I think that's it. Thank you.
And now we can open up for questions.
Hi, thank you very much for your insightful presentation. And I was wondering, as a person with a scientific background, do you feel that your customers trust you more? And also, can you share with us, was it hard for you to adapt to farming? Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. It was Yeah, they do. I swear down they do. And some of them is really funny. I don't know if anyone else has found it just in life. I remember a couple of years ago, someone asking me about her placenta. And I was like, I don't know, what are you talking about? And she's like, well, you're a scientist. Do you know what placentas do? And I was like, I've not really researched that one. So yeah, people definitely do take you more seriously as a scientist. And I think that's helped me in both farming sense and analytical sense, but also on the customer side. Yeah, I think people definitely trust you more, which makes me a bit nervous sometimes because maybe they shouldn't. Maybe I'm terrible, sort of thing. But yes, and was it hard to transition? Yeah, it was. It was, and it's basically learning a whole new industry, because I realized that even though I thought I worked in the food industry, working in cellular agriculture, I realized I knew so little about how actually food is produced, like who is involved, how is the food produced, why are people doing it certain ways and everything. So I realized that these last few years have really taught me some really, really deep questions about the food industry itself. So yeah, it was hard, but it's been rewarding.
There are some questions in the chat. Does Duchess farm still rely on animal inputs like manure, blood meal, bone meal? If it's not organic, would we still have an unhealthy reliance on animals? There is the person who wrote the question knows that there is a lot of research in the UK proving the increased yield with organic farming, and she was just wondering what your take is on this.
Yeah, so we do have manure on the farm. Actually, we're kind of swapping out. So this is where it's difficult, because I think people think having animals back on the farm is amazing or terrible. Whereas we have a small flock of sheep, and basically they're there for a few reasons. They are there not only to fertilize the field, but they do amazing jobs where they walk around. We move them a lot, so they walk around and they mimic animals walking on plants and stimulate growth. So they kind of bite. It's called the no second bite rule, where they bite the top of the plant off and then they move on. So that stimulates plant growth for us, and you can really see it on the farm already. But a big part of what they do is that they take our rapeseed, and in the winter they eat it down really, really fast. So it's like you barely even a plant. Really, really nervous it makes you. But it means they eat this thing called the flea beetle, and it's where this beetle burrows into the plant and lays its larvae. So that would usually be sprayed off by farmers. So now the sheep are on there and they eat all that down. So when the plant grows back, it grows back without any flea beetle larvae, or they don't, and it can really increase, it can really impact yields and stuff. So I think organic farming is amazing. Like, I think all of these options are really, really amazing, but we're not that. And we probably never will be, because animals for us have other uses on the farm, as well as just fertilizing it. But to be honest, like I said, if those sheep still had value enough that we could keep them there instead of having to kill them, I know our shepherd would rather not kill them. It's not a pleasant thing to do. It's literally so that we can continue to try and use them regeneratively on the farm. So I hope that helps. Yeah, organic farming, great if you can do it, for sure.
There is another question in the chat. Would the cultured meat have the same quality as a grass-fed free-range cow? The taste of free-range meat is so much better than the normal one. And I guess the normal means the industrial.
Yeah, so I suppose we haven't done enough research in cellular agriculture to know that completely. An interesting thing is whatever you feed a cow, whatever a cow is eating at the time, affects how the muscle forms, as well as how much exercise it's doing, what breed it is. When I was at Blue Hill, they had 2 butters from 2 different cows, and they tasted different. So you would expect that what you feed it, depending on what you feed it, is how it would taste. I'll have an effect on its taste. But I think there's not been enough research, and I'm not sure, don't quote me on it, but I don't know. I don't think there's any particularly cellulose-based media yet. I still believe it's like corn and soy-esque. You're still taking like those commercial crops, but if there's a way to convert cellulose into a feedstock, quite possibly then you'd have more of a grass-fed cultured steak. So I think to be decided. I think at the moment we're still on processed meats, so I think that might be a little bit way off.
Another question in the chat. What would you tell scientists that want to approach farmers with projects and ideas that might affect their job or farm?
Yeah, really tough topic sort of thing. I think that, so a lot of farmers are, like I said, trying to, there's a few that are trying to make things better, of course, but I think a lot, it comes down to economics. So if you show cellular agriculture as a positive economic opportunity, that's quite a different perspective than it's going to ruin your livelihood. So I think that if you go in saying, you know, this is going to be meat without cows, but the chances are they maybe grow other things, or yeah, basically if you frame it as another economic opportunity, then that's quite a good way to speak to most farmers. And then if they're farmers that are involved in the environmental side, they said it might be that you don't have to kill your animals now. This might be another way, so you can still have an income from having animals, but maybe frees up areas to do other things as well. So I think that's going to be a big part of getting farmers on board, is showing that there is money to be had in still farming, whether it's crops or animals.
Yes, my question was like about the same topic maybe, but like, do you think that with like cellular agriculture, it could like take the pressure off the farmers, so they could like more like advance like to have like cattle farmers could have like beef farmers? It's a luxury product instead, and they maybe don't have that huge pressure of industry farming.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting, because you have to whittle down to why people industrial farm. Like where I worked before, I lived on another farm, and I was sat next to a guy who has an industrial chicken farm. And it's so funny because I think I expect them to be the devil. When I talk to him, he seemed reasonably normal, but it's generally always economically minded. I think it's like, don't think many people want to industrially farm, but it's like, how do I make this work, and how do I get the biggest return for what I'm putting in? So I think that depending on where you are like positioned in it, okay, sorry puppy, where you're positioned in your farming, I think that again, if you're an industrial farming person, you probably will just think, oh, is this another opportunity to make some money for what I'm putting in? Whereas if you have like a herd of cattle, it's like there's a lot of talk of, you know, could you have specialized breeds for different types of cellular agriculture, just like you have different types of meat? Are there different markets for that? Like how much are cells worth? I think that's a big thing we need to have a think about in the field. It's like, how much, you know, are those biopsies worth, and how much are they worth to farmers? And also farmers have had to adapt over centuries. You know, we are now on the farm, you know, regenerative farming was never a thing, heritage grains were never a thing, and then it takes some people to come in and be like, hey, let's try this and grow less of this feed wheat and this shit stuff, and then maybe we can make, you know, a decent living off it, but also do something better for the planet. So I think that farmers are having to adapt, and it's unpleasant, and sometimes it gets messy, but I think that on the whole, the new generation of farmers coming through realize that, I think, if nothing else.
And one final question. How do you think your experience as a heritage grain farmer and establishing the sustainable food story has helped you become a better scientist?
I think that you have an analytical brain as a scientist or an engineer, I think, and that's come into running these things that are not classed as science, sort of thing. But I think that scientist and artist were always the same person. You know, back, especially, you know, philosophers and scientists and artists, they were all counted as the same people. They weren't split into separate, you know, these separate kind of silos of like, you're a scientist, you're an artist, you're a this and this. So I think that learning more about the food system has enabled me to think in ways that I wouldn't have thought of before, and see things like what waste could be used, or how something might look, or how something might taste. And it's just given me such a breadth of knowledge and an experience of knowing like the real world of like what we are trying to make in cellular agriculture. Like, how does it have to interact with the real world? And I think that that's something, again, I didn't really have as a concept. It was like, we're making this thing because industrial farming is bad. So I think it's widened my horizons on what could be possible, but also how it would affect different people. And even studied stuff about botany and seeing, you know, what plants could be involved in the making of meats, and could we use cover crops as, you know, as scaffolds, or, you know, there's so much more we could do to empower regenerative farming, which I think was the thing I felt was missing. You know, I didn't just want to help industrial farming people be less crap. I wanted to empower regenerative farming with cellular agriculture.
Thank you so much, Abi.
Thank you.